bill fulfilled.
On the 19th of June, a conference was held in Donetsk on the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces in Artomovsk. Among the abundant evidence is the testimony on the atrocities against local residents. They killed local residents during their retreat, blew up houses in which there were civilians. The evidence of the Ukrainian army crimes in Artomovsk will be passed to the UN and other international organizations, and they will become a basis for a series of criminal cases. As Daria Morozova, ombudsman of the Donetsk People Republic, confirmed, the criminal actions of the Ukrainian fighters must be assessed not only at the level of Russia's national legislation. The Kiev regime is flagrantly violating international humanitarian law, and all of them will face the global tribunal. Tomorrow, on the 22nd of June, it will be the day of remembrance and mourning in our country. 82 years ago, our ancestors defeated Nazism, and they rid the Europe of the horror of the brown plague. Now the task before Russia is similar, to eradicate Nazism that is rearing its head, and we have no other way but to fulfill it with honor to the victorious end. We will go back to that date, the 22nd of June, and I would like to mention that in the airspace of Germany, the exercise Air Defenders 23 is underway now. It's the largest exercise from the creation of NATO. Around 250 aircraft take part, including 100 American aircraft. It demonstrates that Washington and its allies are developing operational plans for warfare with a comparable enemy. It is clear who is meant by this. During the last decades, Russia has always been mentioned. Baltops 23 also fits this logic. It took place from 4th to 16th of June. The area included also the Kaliningrad region of Russia and the maritime areas adjacent to it. Such exercises again demonstrate that the military machine of NATO has nothing to do with defense. Its efforts are exclusively aimed at all-round deterrence of our country and practicing attack options against Russia. And any attempts to threaten the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Russian Federation will not remain without consequences for its initiators. Now let us have a look at what is happening in Kosovo. The situation in the Serbian province of Kosovo and Metohija is steadily worsening. The so-called self-proclaimed Prime Minister Albin Kurti is leading the situation into a military confrontation. The provocations are becoming even more sophisticated. Illegal detentions of citizens and blocking of the entry on Serbian transport, Serbian tracts continues. Again, Serbian children became victims of Prishtina's punishes. The so-called Albanian Kosovo police beat up minor brother and sister Christian and Dara Radoslajevic. The Kosovo militants made them kneel down, uttering monstrous threats. Only the arrival at the scene of the mother of the children saved the victims. Crimes against civilians, children and women are typical of Kosovo Albanian militants. So what does the West, who is patronizing the situation in the region, I would remind, and speaks about its mediator activities and peacemaking activities for many years, The US and the EU continue to turn a blind eye to Kurdish subversive actions, deliberately bringing the settlement to a standstill in order to force the Serbs to give up their vital interests. The habit of Washington, London and Brussels to please those they are associating Kosovo with the Albanians, it is ineradicable. You know that very well from the recent history. Starting from April 2013, Pristina continues to sabotage the commitment to the creation of the community of sub-municipalities in Kosovo. But instead of pressuring the Kosovars, the US mediators are preparing the ground for a radical curtailment of the community's powers and replace it with a so-called mechanism to protect linguistic rights and support Kurdish thesis that this structure is allegedly non-territorial. That would lead the region to a new catastrophe, another one. And the stable basis for regulation for the settlement exists. It is the UN Security Council Resolution 1244. It is the basis for negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina. And how the situation used to develop in the Balkans when the Western curators approached it with their recipes. Between June 13th and July 13th, 1878, a diplomatic congress took place in Berlin. The formal purpose of that was to sum up the results of the victorious Russian-Turkish war, victorious for Russia. And the representatives, the elite of the European diplomacy of that time took part in those negotiations. And the aim was to stop to prevent the movement of Russia in the Balkans. They tried to reconsider the conditions of the preliminary peace of St. Stefana between Russia and Turkey, which was concluded in 1878. And the greatest anti-Russian zeal during the diplomatic battles was demonstrated by London. They offered to place borders in the Balkans not on political and or economic ground, but in accordance with their own interests. And our country had to protect the outcome of that war on the diplomatic front, not for its own sake, but for the sake of justice, for the sake of legality. In order for the centuries-old struggle of the Balkan peoples for state independence, for true sovereignty, that was back then massively supported by the entire Russian society. All that happened back then. Although the Congress changed the terms of St. Stefana to the detriment of Russia, and the Russian delegation, headed by the Chancellor of the Russian Empire, His Serene Highness Prince Alexander Gorchakov, achieved the recognition of Serbia, Montenegro and Romania. The way was open for Bulgaria to gain independence, and the problems of Albanian and Macedonian statehood were outlined. And our representatives tried just to protect their position. And the best parts of Turkey were taken by the countries that did not participate in the war, but that positioned themselves as peacemakers. Those were Austria, Hungary, and England. The results of the Congress became known later, during the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, and the First World War that followed. The aim was to limit Russia's influence in the Balkans. A hotbed of tension was deliberately created in the Balkans, and it was a basis to create the conditions for new and violent conflicts. We honor the memory of 200,000 Russian soldiers who fell during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878 for the independence of the Balkan peoples, and we value the attitude of the citizens of Serbia, Montenegro, and other countries who know that history and the policy that is conducted in those countries by the West, trying to reconsider the history of connections with Russia. They continue to cherish the memory of Russia's decisive contribution to the attainment of their independence. Some words with regard to the situation in Syria. It is a return to their permanent residence of millions of refugees. Without that, the final normalization in the Syrian Arab Republic cannot be ensured. And the tension that is caused by those people in neighboring countries, in Jordan, Turkey, and the efforts conducted in the Astana Forum format. And in Syria, the major threat that forced the Syrians to leave their homeland, that major threat has been eliminated, but there is a problem. We would formulate the question, who is creating obstacles for such return? The answer is obvious. The US and the Western countries continue anti-Syria policy with determination, and they put obstacles to settlement also of the mentioned problem. It has been serious blockade, not lifted even during the process of the pandemics. And sophisticated political means influencing the specialized agencies of the United Nations, the UN Commissioner for Refugees in particular. A large share of multi-billion contributions that the countries give during their conferences are sent not to the territories controlled by the government of Syria that who are ready to receive the returning people, but to the countries where the refugees are currently residing. So when they take a decision to return to their homeland, they are deprived of the UN aid and are just left by themselves. And just the life forces them to make such decisions. And it is a challenge for such states as Lebanon, Jordan, and another means of influence is the alleged atrocities promoted by the Western countries, arrests, torture, and even murders of those who returned to their homeland. So they are just intimidating picture for the Syrian refugees and the displaced people. There is also work conducted through special activists and even UN employees. Provocative questionnaires in order to convince the refugees that they should not come back to their homeland in the near time. So these are the games that have become part of the Western logic. Desire to harm Damascus, to use this tragic situation with the refugees for their political purposes. It risks destabilizing consequences for a whole range of states in the region. We hope that the return of the Syrian Arab Republic to the Arab family and the restoration of the relations of Damascus with its regional neighbors will contribute to the return of the Syrian refugees to their homeland, to the places of their permanent residence. We will continue to facilitate that together with the Syrian government. I would also like to mention the projects in Africa on connected with UNESCO. Last week, the program on communications development of UNESCO finished in Paris, and it is support for the media outlets in developing countries, and our country declared a voluntary contribution of $250,000 for humanitarian projects in African countries. And those initiatives were proposed by the Africans themselves, and they reflect the true, not imposed from the outside, needs for the journalists in Africa. The Russian Federation fully supports the development of the media in Africa, and is included into the group of friends in order to increase the African profile in the activities of this organization. Our support will continue also in other areas of the work of UNESCO. And one more important cultural event on the 16th of June, following the termination of the end of the 16th meeting of Russian compatriots, there was a trip of the participants in the event to the Patriotic Park. The compatriots laid flowers to the monument to the martyrs of victors, visited the main cathedral of the armed forces, and examined the museum complex, the Road of Memory, and other sites. They also laid a memorial stone in the alley of compatriots in the park. We hope that this tradition to visit the park and plant trees will continue. And now in Addis Ababa, from the 27th to the 30th of June, there will be Days of Spiritual Culture of Russia in Ethiopia. They are held jointly with the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation and the Moscow Patriarchate. There will be an event with the participation of the Kizhi State Historical Architectural Museum. It is included in the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it is a basis. There will be a round table on the proximity of cultural and spiritual heritage. And the participants will include the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the leading institutions in culture and art. And I would also like to dwell in details on the date that will be tomorrow. I have already said that tomorrow it will be 82 years from the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. This date has been called the Day of Remembrance and Mourning officially. It is still pain, mourning for the crippled fate of millions of people, and now for their memory. For some reasons, from the point of view of someone in the West, should be forgotten, but we will not allow that. There is no family not affected by that horrible war. And at the cost of huge efforts, the USSR won that war. And the Nazi ideology was crushed, but it was not totally destroyed on the territory of the Western Europe, and not condemned by the Nuremberg Tribunal to the full extent, because many avoided punishment back then. More than 1,500,000 cities and towns were destroyed. And if we speak about settlements and villages, it is more than 70 thousand villages in our country. The Soviet Union bore the major weight of the Second World War on its shoulders. Its cumulative losses were 40%, almost 27 million people, and it showed, unfortunately, the vitality of Nazi ideology. And as we have already mentioned today, and we often mentioned, Nazism was recreated, and its bases were the hotbeds of collaborators, Nazi remnants in the West. They were not just pardoned by the Western political elites for their own selfish interests, but they were preserved for the future. They were just justified, but that cannot be justified.
We have to admit, frankly, not even 80 years later, the Anglo-Saxons tried to use Nazism as a battering ram to crush Russia, but only now they decided to assign the role of the fascist Germany in the 30s of the 20th century to Ukraine and the Kiev regime, which is, of course, beyond any measure of good or bad, because Ukraine itself experienced all the hardship and atrocities of the Nazi occupation during the war. If you read the materials, if you look at the footage of the chronicles, or if you just take a look at the documents, at the facts of the Nuremberg plan, you will see how smartly the West can carry out such business. And now we understand that all these scenarios, all these plans, have never been abandoned by the West, even despite the criticism of what they had created on the German territory, using the taxpayers' money towards Nazism in support of fascists. This work has been carried out systematically over the past decades. This work of breeding and feeding people who were close to Nazism and fascism of the 20th century that was planned against Russia. And I would like to recall back in 2008 at the 20th NATO summit in Bucharest, Ukraine was lured by potential membership in NATO, and then realizing that they are under the geopolitical patronage of the West, the Ukrainian neo-nationalists, with tacit approval of the US and its allies, began to actively strengthen their position, including in the power structures of Ukraine. And the voting on the Russian resolution on counteraction to glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and related practices, as was constantly voted against by the USA and Ukraine until 2022, and now by the whole West, including the Axis countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, is a telling fact, clearly demonstrating the involvement of Anglo-Saxons in formation of Nazi ideology of the current Kiev regime. And later, Washington and its allies turned a blind eye to all the atrocities and lawlessness happening in Ukraine. First, the legislative reforms, the so-called decommunization, and of course it's not a decommunization at all. If they did want to carry out a decommunization, they probably would have paid attention to something else and not try to carry out totalitarian practices. So everything that has been carried out under the decommunization pretext was actually aimed against Russia. And of course the glorification of Ukrainian accomplices of the German Nazis from the ranks of the OUN-UPA, and what took place after that is hard to explain. There were persecution of veterans of the Great Patriotic War in Ukraine, and then in practice the horrific scenes of Nazi Germany in the 1930s were revived. The Russian-speaking population of the country was harassed and sometimes even medieval mockery. Remember the mass burning of the trade union house in Odessa in May 2014. Dissenters and political opponents were summarily murdered, and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church were persecuted. Residents of Donbass were blatantly exterminated by ideological followers of Bandera and his associates. And of course, right now, at the Ukrainian territory, They're very close to the canonization of banderas. They already have a baptized icon with their image. Not by Raskolnikov, but by people who detach themselves from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So if they're already baptized icons, it's clear that we're not far from their faces being demonstrated. Ukrainian neo-Nazism has been nurtured for years from the outside. And then it has been incorporated to the Ukrainian territory and armed by the collective West, which is now a de facto proxy party to the conflict in Ukraine, has been aiming at it for years. However, we, the heirs of the great victory generation, we have no moral right to allow the Nazi ideology to take revenge. We remember what horrors Nazism led to, what forces the entire world had to use to defeat it. And we see these atrocities today. We see that the work that hasn't been finished yet is unfortunately giving consequences today. We bow to the memory of our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers who fell during the Great Patriotic War. As part of the special military operation in Ukraine, our servicemen today continue their righteous cause, and once again they're fighting the Nazi Hydra. As a tribute to the victims of the Great Patriotic War, state flags will be lowered throughout the country on the 22nd of June, and at 12:15 a minute of silence will be observed, because we remember. We will not forbid this memory, and we will get the justice, because this justice is backed up by the history of peoples who not only fell victims to that regime, but also found enough strength to voluntarily sacrifice their lives for the lives of their relatives, unknown people, and even for future generations. And I'm ready to answer your questions. Is the international life with us? Hello, Madame Zakharova. The European Union is preparing a package of help worth $50 billion. They want to collect it from 3 sources as a voluntary contributions, as well as loans. And of course, once again, Russian frozen assets are brought up. How could you comment another effort to use stolen Russian money to finance the Ukrainian regime? You know, it's obvious that the desire of the West, headed by the Washington, is the sole desire to postpone for as long as possible and to cause as many damage as possible throughout the conflict in Ukraine. There are Nazi ideas pushed on people. They even gain popularity in some artistic images. As I've already mentioned, that Bandera and his associates are considered icons by the church. They're baptized. And it's not just by people who are marginalized, who are separated from the church, but by the people who are proclaimed as the heads, as recognized heads of that religious, which really is a cult. So the West is using Ukraine as their associates' baseless perspectives of the new wave of investments. And there are no investments, but there is this boom. They're talking about technological progress, while in fact destroying anything on the Ukrainian territory, supplying them with arms and war shipments, doing nothing but prolonging that conflict. They're talking about industry. Everyone has been there before. Numerous countries have reached agreements in written form about investments and so on. And so many times the West has lied to them. The only course is to continue the Russophobic course, and the EU aside from supplying them with arms, are also feeding Ukraine countless promises, support, and handouts. But where are those handouts? They're trying to keep the flame burning, that flame of war. And their goal is to keep it burning as much as possible, trying to reach the decades-long power of Kiev regime. And Brussels trying not to draw too much attention. But everyone understands that all too well. And you remember how the West, even taking into account the Allies and fighting the common evil of the Nazi Germany, has gained so much money from the list that was supplied by the Soviet Union. We were fighting the common evil. We were fighting this evil that was nurtured by the West, that was destroying everything in its path. And despite all of this, we had to pay every last penny to our allies. Can you imagine what will happen now? How the people will suffer who live there? And to continue to supply Ukraine with money, the West is unable to do that, unwilling to do that. People are already asking questions about it, where their tax money is going, and when will they start to see the arms, the same arms that are used to kill their citizens, for their fellow citizens, and instead these shipments are going to the black market. And even if they reach the front lines, they're resold. And so this scheme, conducted by Kiev regime, doesn't even take into account that these arms have to be documented somewhere. And then the European citizens will probably protest, but how long will it take until then? It's all up to them. Because the question of where this money is going, where's the feedback of the financial investments into Kiev regime, where is the Western Blitzkrieg? All these questions have to be answered. And as you perfectly understand, the answers will be negative, or they will all be silent. And the West, claiming to be open, they have perfected the art of being silent. And so the Europeans are trying to introduce the innovative approaches to gain those frozen assets, and so they're trying to pass them off as legitimate actions. But of course we understand the blatant economic outlaw actions. And I'd like to recall that before they claimed themselves to be the basis of lawfulness, that we cannot touch anyone's property. But now we see perfectly where this right of property is. They have been pushed aside as something unnecessary. And I assure you that you've probably never heard of human rights in the context of Ukraine from the West. We just need to supply the arms, and human rights will be probably mentioned later on. A lot of European institutions have publicly been claiming that the stealth of Russian assets will be very damaging to the European economy, to the currency of euro. And the so-called attractive economy is fading out, and the European Union has to give back the stolen assets to its lawful owners and to the Russian people, of course. Thank you very much. Moving on. Is the Chinese Media Corporation with us today? Yes, Madam Zakharova, hello. We have one question. The latest data from the Ministry of Finance of the US that the state debt for the first time in history has surpassed $32 trillion, which surpasses for 9 years the prognosis of reaching that position. And Mr. Biden signed a law on the 3rd of June that oversees the raising of that limit from the 2nd of January 2025. So how do you consider the debt crisis in USA? What is your a testament to the actions of the US government. You know, this is what the press is calling the death circus of the American Congress. They not only gave an approval of the continuing growth of the state debt, as you've already mentioned, it has surpassed $32 trillion, but it also surpasses the GDP of the USA. So we see that the United States of America are spending twice as much as they can earn. In our private life, people who act that way, companies or organizations who act that way, we have different names for those, but the result of their existence is the same. If you earn half as much as you're spending and you can't pay off your debts, you end up broke. So it's unclear why there are different geopolitical considerations, talks about some crisis events, except for the most obvious one, the most evident one. So the whole history is resembling of the typical financial pyramid, which, by the way, is illegal from the viewpoint of Western countries, but how else can we approach this? The economy is unable to exist without new doses, and those doses have nothing to supply the health of that economy. So it's a giant bubble. Those bubbles have been popped in the US, and the most staggering example is the crisis with the property market in the US, where people who didn't have enough money, where there were only speculations and just simple speculations, despite numerous investments being made there, the situation fell apart and took down banks and markets along with them. And a lot of people who invested in that were unable to withstand that fall. A lot of companies have gone broke, and the world entered the stage of world crisis. And the reaction to that was not the admission of guilt by the US, them saying sorry, or choosing to opt for a new economy model, but creating of the Big 20. So the international society had to pay for the US experiment. It's hard to say how much longer this will continue. But if we follow the laws of the political economy, the political collapse was due to happen long ago, if only they hadn't been issuing money so fast. As long as the American powers are able to invest money and carry out aggressive actions to prevent the default. But of course, it's all temporary. It's a temporary solution that only destabilizes the world trade even more, and finances are in danger. That is counterproductive to world progress and stability. And so the US have postponed to the post-election period, which is due to take place next year, new plan of destabilizing of the US economy, and the ruling liberal global regime in the US is opting to win some time for themselves. And without taking into account whoever becomes president, just to take off that responsibility from themselves further, first of all on the developing countries, and to lay off the dollar power on them. And the new neo-colonial order of the US, opting for the model of rich north, poor south, or the so-called golden billion, or beautiful garden and wild jungle. And the US are using the dollar as a weapon, and so everyone else is losing faith in dollar. And the countries have to choose alternative instruments for their national currencies to gain any kind of finances. And Russia and China, who do not agree to succumb to the US power or the model of the countries, who have the potential of growth and development, who are backed up by real economy sectors, by real economy, and not the economy of the made-up bubbles. This is gaining pace, creating conditions for the more just multipolar world order, which would be based on mutual respect and sovereignty, basic principles of the international law.
Is Reuters with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. You have already spoken about the shipments of arms today to Ukraine by the Western countries. I have a specific question. Yesterday, in an interview to Reuters, the representative of Ukraine's Ministry of European Integration said that Kiev was in talks with Western arms manufacturers to set up production of Western weapons on the Ukrainian territory. I would like to ask you, is it within the same policy as arms shipments, or should there be additional reaction to that? I have a request for you. Next time when you interview a representative of Kiev regime who would talk about Western countries building arms manufacturing plants in Ukraine to precise their coordinates, it would be very useful to us. Thank you. Thank you. Is Anadolu with us? Yes. Hello, Madam Zakharova. We had two questions. Yesterday we read the ministry commentaries, but we would like still to ask you, maybe you will add something. The Russia's decision not to allow the UN to reach the left bank of the Dnieper to the area of the Kakhovska hydropower plant. So in the commentary there are all the answers. The main answer, it should be a unified standard, but in that case the situation in Nord Streams 1 and 2, the situation in NATO Secretariat, from which side the Zaporizhia power plant was shelled, and taken into account the maniacal desire of the Kiev regime to destroy everything. The Zaporizhia power plant was a desirable target for them. So the UN Secretariat should not avoid questions and say that they do not know something, but to be in charge of such cases, not to try in some way to selectively approach some topic, taking into account who is active in the situation. And I think that there should not be an honest broker, because it's not the market, but a judge, a professional and honest judge. It should be a unified standard, unified for everyone. Or we will just call it assisting to some forces or some actors. And the second question is connected with Moldova. The president of Moldova, Maria Zakharova, said the Constitutional Court's decision to ban the Shor Party was expected by society. On the other hand, we see that Eugenia Guzul, representative of this very party, won the election in Gagauzia. Do you know about those accusations of corruption, and what do you think about those accusations? I totally agree with Maria Zakharova. It's a rare case where I agree with her that the ban of the shore party was expected, because everything can be expected from Maya Sandu. We follow the development of this situation. It's an internal affair of Moldova. But the Moldovan authorities themselves link everything to our country. I mean the government that has a mandate from the population, and the verdict of the Moldovan Constitutional Court to ban the shore party has caused a wide negative resonance in the republic, polarizing even more the Moldovan society. This decision was seen as yet another violation by the authorities to somehow disrespect the democracy for the collective West, in order to please the collective West. And there were open remarks that were voiced openly and that tried to protest against such actions, explaining that by revenge and disrespect to their own citizens, the heads of Moldova, they said that the verdict was the victory of democracy, but that was perceived by the Moldovans just as a cynical farce. And the political scientists note politicized nature of accusations against the shore party. And we see that the elections of the government of Gagauziya on the 14th of May, Eugenia Gusul won those elections. She is a representative of the shore party, and those actions can be taken against other political parties in the country. I can confirm those suspicions. They will not stop. They will continue, and it would have been impossible without the patronizing attitude of the West that is behind Maya Sandu and the Westerners by official Chisinau try to turn Moldova into another Ukraine. It's just imposing Russophobia and writing history, attacking the Russian language, intensification of cooperation with NATO, and neoliberal agenda in introduction of that agenda into public life, no sovereignty and destruction of statehood. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is the news.ru with us? Yes, hello, Newsru is here. We have 3 questions. The first one, the Russian ambassador in Yerevan, Sergei Kapyrkin, was summoned to the Armenian Foreign Ministry in connection with a shooting incident near the Lachin border checkpoint. How has Moscow responded to the protest by the Armenian side? That incident near the Lachin border checkpoint is linked to lack of delimited border with Azerbaijan. The Russian side has many times called on delimitation of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, and we are ready to assist with marking the borderline. And that very area that has just become the basis of quarrel, and we would like to refrain from such rhetorics, and we facilitate the stabilization of situation. Thank you. The second question. The State Department will spend $1 million to study Russian influence on US allies. The initiative has two goals: to raise awareness of ways to counter Russian disinformation, as well as to increase the resilience of audiences targeted by Russia. Does Moscow have any such plans or tools? No, we do not have such plans, do not have them at all. Speaking about the current situation, as our colleagues have informed and diplomats abroad in the center, despite their work, apart from their work, it's just state service, government service. Their duties, they just provide humanitarian assistance, are engaged in charity, and they provide that to those wounded, to those in need. Yes, that is the specific aim, where efforts and money are spent. Such nonsense, no forces, no time, and no money. There is no, they are just absent, and so this approach is just does not correspond to the reality. And here they just try to spend the money, maybe to pass them from one person to another. So the Americans should explain where they spend their money, but it's just some nonsense. And now the last question: does Moscow have any concerns about the context of its strategic partner, China, with the Biden administration? As Antony Blinken said, the heads of states had made progress and reached agreement on some specific issues. Does Moscow have any concern on that? So every side has the right for negotiations, visits, and so on. There are estimations of one party and the estimations of another party. They are somehow different, as you have noticed. And I would like to mention that it's the very case when the negotiations marked by the American side is, how have you expressed it, progressive, yes, reached agreement of some specific issues. So they resulted in an American statement. In response to that, the Chinese foreign ministry officially protested. So for the United States of America, those negotiations were of great importance, but the plane of Blinken has just departed, and the protest note of official Washington in relation to the statement of official Washington followed. But we are sure in our relations with China, with our Chinese partners, for one simple reason: in basic issues of the modern world order, we have common or close positions, respect for sovereignty, not aiming one another, not considering some targets for destruction, and so on. We have our international legal obligations, agreements. We are growing their practical implementation. And it's important that we always stand for the relations with between countries. The difficulties just go to the background, and the countries could agree on something. It's a very highly positive tendency. But there is one small detail in historical contexts. The example of the US promising something to someone and in the US failing to implement what they had promised before. So it's a historical fact. Unfortunately, that's the case. That's the reality as well. But let's go back to the first point of every country having the sovereign right to develop its bilateral, multilateral relations, taking into account that it's an independent state we are talking about. Is the Moscow Post with us? Yes, hello. We have 3 questions today. The first one, the Mongolian parliament places special importance to the relations with Russia. That was stated during the meeting with the Speaker of the Council of Federation, Valentina Matvienko. And in 2019, a declaration on strategic partnership was adopted between the US and Mongolia. How does it influence the region? Are there any potential threats for the transit of Russian gas to China here? The development of our bilateral relations with Mongolia. It's our neighbor, and I would add a friend, who is one of the priorities of Russia in the Asian policy. They are of a multifaceted nature and based on comprehensive strategic partnership, our country's peoples honor the traditions of military brotherhood, the battle on the river of the Khalkhin and the fight against Nazism during the Second World War. We continue to build respectful and equal dialogue in international affairs. And regarding Ulaanbaatar's interaction with Washington, we prefer not to interfere, as I have already mentioned, not to interfere in relations between other states if it is not aimed at the third countries. And as we have many times mentioned, the growth of the US foreign policy activity in some region of the world provokes just another hotbed of tension. And I would like to repeat that it's a deception, as it has been the case with other countries. And regarding our relations with, regarding the friendly relations with China and Mongolia, they continue to be implemented on a mutually beneficial basis. So regarding the access to Kakhovska station, to Kakhovska Dam, the potential nuclear disaster zone, the Zaporizhia power plant, and has the UN Secretariat become more responsive to emergencies? Of course not. I have already answered a similar question today. It's double standards. It's not just some slow reaction or lack of professionalism. It's just supporting a certain group of countries and supporting their interests. So they just should follow a simple rule in order to be objective, not to observe those double standards. And we have called on the Secretariat many times to do that. And with the Nord Streams, as the Western countries blocked our resolution to start the investigation under the auspices of the UN's Secretary General. And that situation with ammonium, it was just obvious. Have you heard anything from, for example, the UN Secretariat against such actions? Nothing. And I would like to draw your attention that that ammonium pipeline was the civil infrastructure for 45 million people. It's just that product security we have heard many times. And if there was that incident in the area of responsibility of the Kiev regime, the Secretariat could express its concern, at least to tell that it's bad by itself, at least that. But they just try to present that they do not see anything and they do not have the data. And when they they are asked to precise that data, they just disappear and they just do not answer. So we have all the basis to doubt the impartiality of international servicemen, and that incident. There was the statement that incident was due to the actions of Russia, and Sergei Lavrov reacted to that. It should not be. It should be linked to the coup d'etat on the territory of Ukraine, and the West just interfered. It just put people with Western citizenship in the government, and all that would not have happened, including the situation with the Kakhovska station. And I think that some objectivity should be demonstrated, and we should address historical events, but I do not want to look at historical events as well. And when they are asked to assess in accordance with the current situation, they just do not answer. They say that need more time and just disappear. For us, the guilty are just obvious. We informed the UN Security Council on the Kiev regime plans to destroy the dam in the Kherson region, and those points were there were those points. There was justification for that, and we passed on the information regarding those events that took place in those months. And these are the facts. They are obvious. Thank you very much. My third question.
With the participation of the Russian Orthodox Church, the transfer of Ukrainian prisoners of wars of Transcarpathian origin to Hungary took place. Could you tell a little bit about the history of this action? I can confirm that on the June 8th of this year, on the official website of the Russian Orthodox Church, on the church line, that such an exchange was agreed upon. And I think you should contact the ROC directly for details. Thank you very much. Moving on. Is Verelk with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. I have 4 questions for you today. Wow, a lot of them. We haven't seen you in a long time. I was beginning to think that this is it. The first question you have partially answered to, but why Russian peacekeepers have taken part in the Azerbaijani border guards, which has gained a lot of reaction in Armenia after the Russian ambassador was summoned to the Armenian Foreign Ministry. But we weren't the one to summon the ambassador. It was the Armenian Foreign Ministry, so perhaps you should ask them about the details. We only have our reaction and our response to that. I cannot agree with your reaction about the actions or the steps of Russian peacemakers that are carried out in the context of one party, because they're peacemakers and they're actually acting out in the interests of both parties. I have already commented on this today, so I have nothing to add. The second question, for several days, Azerbaijan has been blocking all kinds of humanitarian transport to Artsakh, which was accompanied before by representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Russian peacekeeping contingent. So we would like to understand, what does Russia plan to do to resolve this issue? And if Azerbaijan continues to violate it so rudely, and Russia is unable to get Baku to fulfill its obligations, can we consider that the trilateral statement is no longer valid? We continue to work through the Russian peacekeeping contingent and other channels to fully unblock the Lachen corridor, and we expect the Armenian and Azerbaijani sides will continue to implement all the commitments under the trilateral statement on November 9th, 2020. And we think that it's still valid. And we would also like to add that we urge Yerevan not to withdraw itself from the work in trilateral formats. Downtime in their activities has a detrimental effect on the situation in the region and leads to an escalation on the ground. And we urge Baku to take steps to fully unblock the corridor for humanitarian purposes and not to hold the Karabakh population hostage to political differences with Yerevan. Thank you very much. Third question. There was a piece in RIA Novosti citing a diplomatic source that the US is apparently seeking talks between Artsakh and Azerbaijan and a third country, threatening that otherwise Baku will conduct a forceful operation in Karabakh. So we have the question, how can Baku conduct a military operation in Karabakh, given the presence of Russian peacekeepers there, and given the very difficult situation that has been recorded there, and the threats in Azerbaijani media? What will the Russia's position be? First of all, as for the aforementioned RIA Novosti article, it has appeared in several media sources. Unfortunately, the information given there is trustworthy. Second of all, Russia is ready to promote the dialogue between Baku and Stepanakert on ensuring the rights and security guarantees for the population of Karabakh, which we have repeatedly stated to the interested parties. And thirdly, the Russian peacekeeping contingent is deployed in the region in accordance with the trilateral statement of the leaders that I have already mentioned from 2020, November 9th, which defines the basic framework for its activities. And let us repeat, the main task of the Russian peacekeepers is to maintain the ceasefire in their area of responsibility. As for how valid and how viable the idea of those operations, as I have already mentioned, by the information, this information is trustworthy. And after that, it all depends on how the law approach that has been ingrained in those statements, how it could take over, or maybe they will carry out, or at least try to carry out, the destructive plan of what was mentioned in mass media. We've seen it numerous times of the efforts and desires to somehow stray these parties from what has been agreed on, from the legal path, and once again draw them into a chaotic, unpredictable turn of events. Of course, we opt for the first option, to follow everything that has been agreed upon. And I believe that we have contributed a lot of our efforts, proved everything that had to be proved, followed the actions at every single step, from the situation on the ground to the economy. And I reiterate once again, this path is not so easy. It's a hard, everyday work that has to do with a lot of effort. But we have been doing it and are ready to keep doing it. And our last question, Madame Zakharova, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, yesterday at a meeting on the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry to investigate the circumstances of the 4-day war, said that Russia had actually failed to achieve a ceasefire, including on 19th of October, due to Azerbaijan's ever new demands. As I've already mentioned, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that it was the Armenian side that refused to sign. So how was it really? What really is the case? What happened on the 19th and 20th of October? You know, we think that the mentioned meeting of the Armenian Parliamentary Committee is connected with the continuation of the inner political processes in Armenia itself. And for our part, I'm not sure we should comment on the debate that is currently taking place there. But of course, the details of the confidential talks at the highest level are also out of my reach. We simply do not comment on that. But I would like to draw your attention that no matter how heated up that debate gets, there is the truth that is supported by the facts, and it was Russia that was able to achieve a ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh in the autumn of 2020 and restore peace in the region. And this was fixated on paper in the statement of the leaders of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. What else should we think? Because those statements have been worked out after the negotiations, have been accepted by all three parties. Is anyone willing to withdraw their signatures and their agreement? So leaving behind anything that is mentioned in the inner agenda of each country, we're following the official position that has been announced by the government, by the heads of the government of this or that country. This is our guideline. And we would suggest that all sides focus not on finding those to blame for the events of 3 years ago, but maybe leave that to the historians, but on the implementation of a set of trilateral agreements at the highest level in 2020-2022. They are a basic, non-alternative roadmap for the Armenian-Azerbaijani normalization process. Thank you very much. Thank you. Tverskaya 13. Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have one question today that has already been partially mentioned by you. I thought that since you're a Moscow newspaper, first of all, it is a great celebration for you because today's... Thank you. Tverskaya 13. Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have one question today that has already been partially mentioned by you. I thought that since you're a Moscow newspaper, first of all, it is a great celebration for you because today's the birthday of the mayor of Moscow, Mr. Sobyanin. So let me, in addressing you, join numerous wishes and of course express our gratitude that we live, I can say sincerely, that we live in the best city in the world that incorporates traditions and new approaches. And this city is headed by someone who is dearly beloved. So let me join once again all the wishes and congratulations and say it sincerely from the bottom of my heart. No matter where you go, it's like some kind of a song. No matter who we talk to, no matter what kind of political debate is on the agenda, everyone agrees that Moscow is a marvelous city, the capital that shines, that glistens, and that stands as a great example of how you can combine tradition with new approaches, history, and modern times. I agree with you completely. Our question is about Moldova. The situation of Moldova and the choice of foreign policy remind you of how the current policy of Kiev regime developed. So the West is preparing another country to fall down. So they're replacing their tradition with new deprivation of language and history. They're depriving democracy of parties' opinions that about the situation in Moldova, the situation that has been provoked by people who are supported by the West, people who have been inserted in that society by the West. And so these people do not support the interests of the people of Moldova or the country, but those external interests that have been bestowed upon them. And the choice to abandon the democratic principles in order to destroy democracy and attempt to settle scores with political opponents and eradicate dissent and a show of disrespect for their own citizens. This is like a stark example of the West. I doubt that you can give me an example of historical period, a date, or a fact that could resemble the chaos, the craziness that is currently taking place due to the Santu government actions. I've tried to find any kind of parallels with renaming of the language, and I don't think there is any. There was a lot of it. There was the forbiddance of language or the ignorance, but to ignore your own language, you're in favor of foreign people, people who have nothing to do with this country, and to rename it. I have no recollection of such action. Perhaps they're just preparing for them to be Romania in the future. Of course, there is no doubt. Can come together, can change as much as they want out of their own free will. But there are two important points. First of all, it has to be done when it's based on the opinion of the people living there, but nobody asked the people living there what do they want. As you know, Santa came along that she's aiming for the best practices of the Western democracy, and this is what she's trying to implement. I'm sorry, but Switzerland, for example, if they want to repaint the walls or something, they always hold a referendum how to park cars, how to carry out city practices. Every single question is taken to the point of a referendum in Switzerland. And here it's a question that concerns the whole country, its cultural identity and self-determination. And this question is decided by a circle of certain people on behalf of the whole nation. And any kind of union is possible. But of course, first of all, you have to ask the people and truly ask them, not just based on important sociological research. No, you have to base on legalized, in the right field opinion, public opinion, which is usually a referendum or some kind of way that expresses the public opinion. And secondly, I've truly never been carried out not on an equal basis. It has to take into account respect for the people of two or more countries. It has to be an integration process. Can you imagine some country joining the European Union over the last decade, just evaporating in European Union, renaming their language, changing, reshaping their cultural identity? On the contrary, everything that belongs to the European Union and at the OSCE space points out the rights of minorities, even those who cannot influence changes on the political scale or political things, but they always have the right to express themselves, to express their views and opinions, no matter if it's about history, about modern things, politics. So here we have two conditions that have to be followed, but the fact that this process is gaining pace cannot be denied. So of course we see all of that in Moldova. Here are some fresh examples. The Moldovan leadership is now not lowering the already excessive level of anti-Russian rhetoric, in particular on 19th of June this year. In an interview with the German program, President Sandu once again tried the topic of Russian propaganda and Kremlin agents. I don't know who these people are. I know there are Romanian agents in leading positions, but about Kremlin agents or Russian propaganda, I have no idea what they're talking about. Everything has been blocked. On June 13th, a monument to victims of the totalitarian communist occupation regime was unveiled in Singary in the presence of Moldovan officials. Excuse me, but there were a lot of citizens and residents. Czech of State Russian Drama Theater in Chisinau has almost entirely excluded Russian classics. And of course, the Czech of Theater has to implement Russian classics. And the theater itself, they're trying to rename into the National Drama Theater. And against this background, the Eminescu Theater in Chisinau shows a production of The Business of Siberia about, as they called it, the extermination of the Bessarabian population during the Soviet occupation. Are they okay? Where are all the people who know history, who know how the Moldovan population, along with the Soviet Union, defended their own territory from fascists, from Nazi? Where are those people? And why, nowadays, they're not the ones creating this informational agenda of Moldova? The answer is very simple. They're blocking any kind of different way of thinking, and they're ignoring history. We have already seen something like this in Ukraine, and it is well known what this has led to every day. I have no hope that the Moldovan authorities who pretend to be Democrats will finally realize we're blindly following the advice of Western comrades will lead the Republic. I have no such faith. But sometimes this understanding comes abruptly due to a crisis. Perhaps that's the most realistic route here. Because we cannot just ignore the public opinion of the nation. We cannot spark hate towards one nation or another. We cannot reignite the flame of nationalism, because it just splits the society, Moldovan society in particular, and generates military and political tension in the region. Thank you very much.
Is Yura daughter, are you with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova, hello. Yura daughter, are you? First of all, I would like to comment on your statements with regard to Moscow. My mother's city is St. Petersburg, from where you have recently returned. Would you like to argue? No, I just couldn't help noticing that. So, locations. You can love many cities, but it's you cannot help noticing that. Into what Moscow turned and what experience it can provide to everyone else. It's not the issue of our personal relation to some locations. It's just the issue of objective reality. I do not want to argue. I expect the opinions of everyone. When we characterize some locations, it's a certain number of criteria. It's the city, a year and a half, maybe even more, 2 years and a half. The first year of the pandemic's finished. It was the first year of the pandemics that was coming to the end. Yes, something like that. It was highly estimated by the UN that has such ratings. It's not just my personal relation, it's just this situation. So in a diplomatic manner, I would agree with you. So my first question, it's a visit of the Turkish president to Baku and his meeting with Turkey is ready to open a consulate general in Shusha. Isn't this statement and future inauguration of the general consulate a potential threat to the Russian peacekeepers in the region and to the peace talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan mediated by Russia? You know, the issue of inauguration of consular offices somewhere are a topic of bilateral relations, in this case between Baku and Ankara. In other cases, it should be referred to two sovereign states. But we understand that this issue is sensitive for Yerevan, and in our contacts with partners, we systematically orient them towards taking into account the interests of others and the necessity to normalize Armenian-Azerbaijani and Armenian-Turkish relations. Thank you very much. Another question. The visit by Sergei Lavrov to Belarus for a meeting of CSTO foreign ministers. During communication with journalists, he said that the West is trying to hinder the relations between within the CSTO. You mean in the context of the CSTO or in general? I think that the minister meant in the context of the CSTO, irritating for the West. I would like to cite some examples, not only from the current period, but we see with what difficulty, due to natural reasons and also due to the artificially created problems, the CSTO, how it interacted with other international organizations. It's normal for intergovernmental organizations to provide some status, to have dialogue with different organizations in the world, regional and other. But in this case, it was linked to some not very simple history. It was not automatic, as it is the case with the Western countries' associations. But it's obvious that someone assisted there. And in the West, they do not conceal their aims to hinder the CSTO. They provide special benefits to those who do not cooperate with the CSTO in connection with the massive information political work on the territory of the countries. It's not just the interaction with the state. It's informational work. It's misinformation with regard to the CSTO, publishing and posting on the internet of fake news, fake news of offensive nature and many other things. And you can witness many such things yourself. There are just direct conditions for the refusal, and there are proposals, direct proposals, aimed at some destruction of the organization from the inside, from the outside, and so on. There are proposals, and there are a lot of materials that do not have any basis. They are published even in our media, in the CSTO region, and the organization itself also mentions that. And during the ministerial meeting, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov talked about his colleagues that the Westerners' proposals to increase interaction in the military sphere, they should be treated extremely critically because the double standards of such cooperation are obvious. Sensitive data, we should not question the right of our allies to build relations, but we think that our partners should beware those growing risks for the security space. And this CSTO is just acting in another direction, is just offering the unifying agenda for its member countries in contrast to the destructive attempts aimed at the CSTO. They have confirmed their willingness to increase the cooperation and to react on an increased number of threats. Could you please give specific examples? I have already given the specific examples. You are just asking, just point your finger at a name or the title, but it is the case in different areas. That's the information field within the countries. I can just give you several examples. There are articles by political scientists, so-called, and those political scientists, they're just supported by grants or some other support by the Western countries, and they promote ideas about it's if people just were based on their own analysis. The latest years of the CSTO actions show that it has concrete results in its work, and it's just impossible not to notice that. Those who do not notice that, they're influenced by certain forces. Those things published or placed on the internet is just in the common information field, and there are different languages, and it's done by either within the NATO structures or the United States that place in NATO some commission for such actions, or by American diplomats who work in a certain country. Is Golos Отечество, the voice of the fatherland, with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. So I still would like to come back to the issue of Moscow. Please, could I please come back to uray.ru? Yes, I have never done that, but please, when you just go to someone's party, to someone's birthday, you hear many things that are pleasant towards someone who is the host, and you do not stand up and say we have a better situation and it's a holiday. If it's a holiday, it's just a tradition to speak that. It should be spoken, told from the bottom of the heart, and it's the pride of Moscow residents, and not only of the Moscow residents. I see the reaction of the residents of our country and those living, studying here, foreign students. They see with great warmth and with great gratitude that they treat this city and those who make it the way it is now, the way we see it now. So thank you very much, and I just agree with you. It's not a diplomatic, it's just an agreement. Now, the voice of the fatherland. Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have 3 questions today. The first one, during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, you discussed the digital sovereignty issue. You talked about the need to make sense of the fundamental transformation that is underway, saying that we should understand where we are moving. And it's the question of ideology. In the Russian Constitution, Article 13 prohibits state ideology. I do not see any contradiction. I really do not see just some aims are just another thing. Those issues can be interrelated. They can contradict each other. But you're citing my speech, and I was talking about aims. And because the ideology it's wider, it just means it's philosophy. It's just some way of seeing the world from a political or economic point of view. It's about the final outcome, the aim and the tasks that we follow, and it's for the efficiency of the process. Any process can have the point it should reach, or it should be trying to reach at some moment. And in that context, we were talking about that the estimation of efficiency. It's the efficiency, the how quick is it? It will be assessed if you understand the aims and the tasks, and then this estimation will be objective. But ideology, it's just wider. It's just a more complex notion. And can there be a conclusion that the constitutional reform is prepared to change the state ideology? So we just, it was in that connection, and your question should be addressed to those who are in charge of domestic policy. And maybe our legislative authorities, those who are in charge of domestic legislation. So then let's move on to the global agenda. When will Russia launch the procedure to terminate the bilateral treaty on the sovereignty of Ukraine? There is just a lack of such treaty, because in the treaty of the 19th November 1999 on the relations between the two Soviet republics, the RSFSR and the USSR, the republics recognize each other as sovereign states. And that treaty, the 1990 treaty, was replaced by the Treaty of Friendship of the 31st of May 1997, Article 39, which was denounced by Ukraine and expired on the 1st of April 2019. And if the US, they just understand only the brutal force language, can the foreign ministry employ the mechanism of nuclear deterrence in order to create the threat for the United States, in order for them to abolish the attempts to defeat Russia on the battlefield and stop supplying weapons? And in accordance with the doctrinal documents, those events with regard to the nuclear deterrence, those measures are taken constantly. And there is also the principle that nuclear weapons use is possible only with some conditions, and those conditions are well known to Washington. They have been informed on and mentioned by us many times. And Sergei Rybkov, Deputy Foreign Minister, just has commented in his interview and commented in details. I just offer you to study his comments. And I would like to underline the following. The most danger is that within the framework of the aggressive policy of the USA and NATO, as they formulated strategic defeat on Russia, they're just growing, increasing stakes, and are more and more involved in military confrontation. Such policy the direct attacks of nuclear states and there are just huge risks of the worst scenario. And we should just take into account the seriousness of the situation, and we pass these signals to the West. But the West is just totally in anti-Russian hysteria and hybrid war, and it has no readiness to adequately study our position. And the responsibility for the degradation, the further degradation of the situation, is borne by the Western capitals. And Russia is determined to protect its security interests, and we do not recommend the West to doubt that. Thank you very much. Is Radio Saga with us?
If they're not with us, yes, we're here. Of course, hello. Hello, Madam Zakharova. Hello, dear colleagues. There has been information about threats, more specifically of these, including as a phenomenon in Western diplomacy, and of course the story of the African delegation who have been stopped at the Polish airport, who cannot carry out their peacemaking mission. Could you comment what the Russian Foreign Ministry is aware of? As you know, this is not the first case of this approach of the dominating phenomenon from the United States of America, from the West. We've cited numerous examples when the UN General Assembly resolution, and it's not a Security Council, but the UN General Assembly, they used blackmail towards those who voted. So they didn't use the existing instruments of interacting with countries, but they directly threatened those who took place in voting on the ground. We have cited numerous examples of that. And we always relied on the diplomatic methods as well as negotiations as a means of resolving current issues. We have rich diplomatic traditions. We have tragic experience of offensive wars, of defensive wars, and Russian people is not seeking out. As for political direction, we're following our all the commitments that we have taken in terms of good neighborhoodness based on the principles stated in the United Nations organizations. These are the relations and contexts that we have been building in the CSTO, all the Eurasian colleagues, African colleagues, Middle Eastern colleagues, and diplomatic work from Russia. We do not use blackmail or any kind of political pressure or even psychological pressure in order to ensure our goals, just because even if the West can achieve their short-term goals like that, it turns against them. We are building a just and open dialogue with our colleagues using the arguments based on facts and give the opportunity to freely decide on the approach of our partners to everything that is taking place. The main word is freely. We use so many words from the West about freedom, which is a basic principle, that when we see their business in action, we get a distortion of how their approaches that have been promised with our partners, with those who are our allies or our friends or friendly neighbors. So we're carrying out business and international relations like that. The principle of freedom, this is our guiding light. And this approach is not only received with understanding, it's the main common point, even when the situation is not in favor of that. We hear countries of the global south, how Americans, unlike us, are carrying out methods of the forceful diplomacy. And this term comes from English. They're freely going all out with threats of sanctions, other measures of control and manipulation, and even punishment. And not only towards people taking part in negotiations, but even towards their family members. For example, one of the ways of putting pressure on those, if people have some kind of property abroad, or their family members are living in Western countries, or their children are studying abroad, our minister, Mr. Lavrov, has mentioned it numerous times. This is what he was referring to, how his colleagues and partners have frankly mentioned it during the negotiations, that they see that from the West, this approach taking place at the voting process of the UN General Assembly was based on this forceful approach. And Mr. Lavrov once again mentioned an example from his own practice when a colleague from a developing country has complained about a pressure from the US on his capital towards the denial of contact with Moscow. So the head of the department asked to the US what kind of alternative are they offering, and the answer was surprising. They were like, we promise not to introduce sanctions. So it's not that they're promising anything, they're simply promising not to make the situation any worse. So what exactly is driving their thoughts, their ideas? So who is in favor of that? Nobody's in favor of that, but someone is ready to stand up to them, and someone is unwilling to do that. So we'll leave it to them to decide on their approaches. We're opting for a different one, and I'm sure that one way or another, once again, they will fall victim to their own course of action. Of course, we're talking about the loss of art of diplomacy, feeling of pursuit of the world and trying to force everyone into fighting Russia, financing of illegitimate means of international game. NATO countries are continuing to interfere with the US, British, and European heads are trying to, they've tried to force foreign participants to stop from coming to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. They're trying to use blackmail, sabotage, any means of manipulation. Americans try to visit countries who have been in close contact with Russia to destroy previously reached agreements. We know that you have reached these agreements with Russia. You need to destroy them. What will you get in response? We won't make your situation any worse. That is their logic. So all the materials, all the methods are well known. We have a lot of proof and facts, and I would like to point out once again that they will fall victim to this mentality, to this approach, as has happened much. Is that it? That's it? Is the compatriots together with us today? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Mr. Lavrov, in his statement yesterday with the University of Cooperation and Support, has pointed out three important directions. Priority of supporting Russian citizens abroad. Second, creating a club of friends of Russia. And third, the creation of movement of Russophiles. Could you please comment anything on that or give some additional information? Of course I can.
С обострением геополитической.
The situation with the worsening political situation is clear, and the spiritual and cultural connections of countries with our own and they always end up as a target in organizations of our compatriots in many countries. Activists and typical citizens are facing an unprecedented pressure and attacks, and sometimes those threats are being carried out. And in these conditions, the united front of Russian people living abroad is our own special mission, and it first comes from our compatriots who are asking us to support them. And millions of our compatriots are making a huge diaspora community actions who are continuing to support Russian language, our traditions, celebrating our events. And today the Russian Foreign Ministry and our foreign departments and government commission on the help of compatriots abroad are paying special attention to continue the livelihoods of people living abroad so they can be a great point of support for compatriots abroad. And these structures are contributing greatly to support Russian historic and cultural humanitarian heritage, to continue promoting Russian language. And I would say to reflect their ideas in the action that they're carrying out abroad, to protect children and young people from the ever-present abroad degradation of their principles, to protect the institution of family and children. And current work with these communities is, of course, adapting to the current external situation. It comes with helping the common Russian cultural identity, information work, and of course a lot of work with actions and events, and a lot of the steps that we have been taking towards uniting people around the ideals of Russian world. And as for the successful international movement of Russophiles that took place on March 14th, that united 87 foreign delegates from 42 countries, it showed to the world and to the international community the common position to improving international cooperation and promotion and conservation of Russian cultural heritage against the backdrop of Russophobic politics carried out by the West. And representatives of that movement continue to work support Russian culture and its presence abroad. And on April 29th, as you know, there was a global conference on multipolarity online with more than 100 participants from countries from 5 continents. Further development of dialogue on this theme is envisioned in different formats. We're preparing the second meeting early next year. Other than that, representatives of the movement are ready to support different initiatives and events to popularize Russian science, culture, education, to preserve monuments connected with Russia. And the main initiators of that movement want to involve their potential as much as possible to introduce an international movement that will support the respectful and mutually beneficial dialogue. And one of their tasks is to fight against Russophobia in all its forms. And their personal mission, I've talked to most of them, is to promote objective information about Russia. The initiative created by the international community, another initiative among those, it's not the only one, another one, is the Club of Russian Friends, which has been introduced by the Russian political party United Russia, that stands for uniting our. And the online platform will be supported by in-person meetings, delegations meeting, and all sorts of events. Participation for this event is open to all of those who want to participate and to support Russian world, politicians, parliamentarians, public defenders, representative of business spheres, even from non-friendly countries, because we divide the policy of regimes, of anti-Russian, from highest officials of some countries, from the politics of people who are open for connection and contacts with our country, who are doing it as a personal protest for that horrible, racist, nationalist high that their leaders are following in their countries. The most important thing that all the participants are open to mutually respectful, productive dialogue. That is the goal. Members of United Russia, Senator Klimov, has already held a session at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and at Kaliningrad on the sides of the political forum to supporting our compatriots abroad. And the next event is planned for the 23rd of June in Minsk, together with Belarusian party, Belarus. If you don't have any questions, I would like to end the briefing here and to say goodbye until next time. I wish you all the best. Goodbye. Thank you.